Hello and welcome to UK Column. I'm delighted today to be joined by two special guests. We've got Matt Campbell, who very sadly lost his brother, Jeff, at the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. And also by Ted Walter, who is Executive Director of the International Center for 9/11 Justice. Welcome to the program, both. Matt, let's get started with you because this is about your brother after all. So we could begin, just give us a rundown of what happened and what has happened since September 11th to try to get some clarity on what happened.
Well, that's a journey. So my brother was living in New York, in Manhattan, and he was attending the Risk Waters Conference, which was a British event put on the 106th floor of the North Tower. And, sadly, Jeff was there when the attacks happened. And whilst we kind of accept that there's very little chance of him being alive sort of 5-6 days after 9/11, we only actually got remains of him identified in June the following year in 2002. And gradually over the years, we've had more remains identified all through DNA. We're talking very small fragments from my brother being found and identified. And I mean, for me, I started looking a little bit more into what happened on 9/11 and more probably what the US and the UK were doing post 9/11 in terms of wars and stuff. And I think just over the years, I just started to question more and more about what we had been told. And in the UK, because my brother's remains were identified and they were repatriated back to the UK, we have this thing called an inquest, which is where you establish, okay, who were they, where did they die, and when did they die, and how did they come about their death. And that the inquest was joint with 9 other victims, and it was adjourned in 2004, which is quite common. They wait a while to do supposedly their investigation, and then in January 2013, he actually had the inquest, which was with these 9 other victims, and I didn't attend. In fact, out of the 10 victims, I think only 2 families were represented. And it really, it wasn't until I got hold of the audio and the transcript of the inquest that I sort of realised, how little actually went on in that formal process that they went through in terms of establishing, how my brother basically died. There was a couple of minutes spent on him as an individual, but in all, I think they covered all 10 deaths in like an hour and a half, hour and 40. And it felt very much like kind of just rubber stamp, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, except, we now know that really they didn't do an awful lot of dotting the I's and crossing the T's because there wasn't much in the way of an inquiry, I don't think, in actually, how my brother came about his death, which is the point of an inquest.
Jeff was one of, I think it was 67 British victims that day. Have all 67 had a similar experience in terms of the British authorities and any inquest that happened?
I mean, all I know is, from my communications with the Met and obviously at the inquest itself. So, okay, 67 were British victims, but a lot of those were actually living over in America. And like I said, if the remains weren't either found or repatriated, there's no automatic inquest in this country. So all I know is those 10 that were held in the inquest. And I know that 4 of the people of those 10 were at the Risk Waters conference. I don't know how many more people have been identified out of the British victims, but we know that there's over 1,100 people still not identified. Not a tiny fragment of them has been identified. 22 years on, that's 40% of all the victims.
Yes. Okay. So an inquest has happened, and it's had a pretty unsatisfactory result because it seemed, as you said, to be a rubber stamping exercise. So what did you do after that then?
I think, I went public kind of in terms of how I'd been feeling for over 10 years about 9/11, and it was through meeting, I guess, people interested in actually getting to the truth of 9/11 in London initially, and then I went out to the States and met people from architect engineers and just people who were interested. And myself and Ted, we met in 2018, something like that. I think I went out there to talk on one of the anniversaries, and I just said to him, look, the quickest, I want my brother's inquest opened because I don't feel there's been a proper inquest into my brother's death, which should happen when someone's died in these kind of circumstances. And we just started talking about, okay, how could we bring that about? And I think over a couple of years, that kind of formulated into, right, let's just go ahead and test the waters again. Because I'd already spoken with a barrister and it became clear, A, it was expensive, and B, really wasn't in a position to move ahead. And it wasn't until I sat down, had a chat with Ted, started to formulate a plan. And then I think it was early 2020, just decided, let's just go for this, see if we can raise the funds, do an initial overview with a barrister who frankly was quite shocked that A, we had all this new evidence that hadn't been considered, and B, the fact that there was no real inquiry whatsoever. And he's an assistant coroner, so he knows what goes on in inquests, as well as being a barrister. And so, yeah, rather rapidly we raised, sufficient funds to lodge the, I think, 2,500 page application with the Attorney General in August 2021. So, here we are, 22 months on, and we got back a very, very short response from the Attorney General, just turning down our application, and really reasons that don't make any logical sense. If you read the letter, my father's response was, it looks like someone's put it together in 15 minutes and they've not even had a proofread of it. And he doesn't really know a lot of the details, but he just, at the face value, it was like, this is a poor letter. A barrister obviously looked at it and has just said, this is, it's not what he would expect, given his 25 years of experience, response from, something as official as the Attorney General's office. And so, we've had a fair bit of discussion over the last couple of weeks, and, the path we want to take, and that's not just me, it's my family as well, is to go down the judicial review path and actually challenge the Attorney General's decision, which is basically putting it in front of a judge.
Oh, okay. Well, look, maybe we could turn to Ted at this point then. And Ted, well, first of all, by way of introduction, we've had an idea of how you got involved in this, but why have you decided to get involved in this particular case?
Yeah, as Matt said, he and I met in person in September, I believe it was 2018, and we had been corresponding a little bit before that, and I was aware of him and his efforts to try to open a new inquest and get the truth and justice for his brother. But we finally met in 2018 and started talking about this particular strategy. And to me, it was apparent very quickly that this was a really promising strategy, that there weren't a lot of avenues available then or now to getting a new investigation of 9/11, whatever the scope may be. This seemed like a very promising avenue, and Matt and his family were very dedicated to pursuing it. They were and so I wanted to support them as well on a personal level. And at the time, as Matt mentioned, I was working with architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, and I said, I think that we have the base of supporters and the energy behind our organization to help you raise the funds that are needed, and to also provide assistance in terms of putting together the application that would be submitted to the Attorney General. We actually waited a little bit to see if the government might change, because as you might recall, and I don't know these details very well, but Jeremy Corbyn was sort of on the rise, and we thought that his government might be more amenable to this application. And so we waited to see if he might come to power before submitting this application. Of course, that didn't happen. And so after that, in 2020, we said, well, let's not wait around anymore. Let's just go for it. And we consulted with Nick Stanage, the barrister at Doughty Street Chambers, who Matt mentioned. And Matt looked at the evidence that we had and was, as Matt said, just blown away. And the reading of the law, Nick's reading of the law, that we're dealing with here, that enables families to open a new inquest, if there's evidence that was not considered at the first inquest, is really straightforward, and the threshold's very low. So we had even a better chance, according to our barrister, than I even realized in the initial years of talking to Matt. And he said, this application of once we put it together will easily meet the threshold to open the inquest based on new evidence that was not considered at the first inquest, because the only test that the court and the attorney general are supposed to look at is, was this evidence considered at the first inquest? Is there even a remote chance? Is there any possibility that it might change the original conclusion at the original inquest? And it's not really for the attorney general or even the court to weigh and come to a determination of how likely it might be for the new evidence to change the original conclusion of the original inquest. If there's any possibility at all, and if the family wants the new inquest should happen. And that was the legal test that the attorney general was supposed to use in reviewing this application that was submitted 2 years ago. And sadly, the attorney general has completely failed to use that test and ignored that test. And, we can talk about that in a little bit of detail. And it also became clear when we looked at the transcript from the inquest back in 2013 that the coroner, not only was all of this evidence not presented, which is unfortunate, but sort of understandable in the circumstances, but the coroner did not spend even a second of the inquest actually interrogating the question of how the towers came down, how the airplane caused the buildings to collapse. And yet, despite that, the actual form, the inquisition form, where the conclusions of the inquest are written, actually states that the impact of the airplane into the North Tower caused the building to collapse, and that's what caused Jeff's death. And so the coroner actually stated a conclusion for which no evidence was heard. There was no discussion whatsoever of the causation of the building's collapse, and yet that's what's in the original inquisition form. So that's the other ground on which we're challenging the original inquest and asking for a new inquest to be opened. And it's mind-boggling, in fact, that the attorney general has said no to this application. But that's how I got involved, was recognizing that this was a very promising strategy and that Matt and his family were dedicated to it, and I wanted to help them.
So Matt, one of the things I wanted to clarify with you was why this had to go to the Attorney General in the first place. Does this happen in every case where an inquest, a family is asking for an inquest to be reopened, that it's a decision for the Attorney General?
I think if we had perhaps responded quicker after that initial inquest, I think it's 6 months, something like that, you don't need to go down the route of the Section 13 of the 1988 Coroners Act, but it's the only option open to us. But it's not time limited. I mean, there are cases where people have gone back, 20, 30, 40, 50 years and had inquests reopened. So, yes, this was our only course of action to request the Attorney General to give us permission. There was a fast track route as well, which sadly the sitting coroner of the West London Coroners Court didn't take, which was they could have just looked, because they got copied into the application and gone, oh yeah, crikey, no one did any investigation. You've met the threshold. We could just reopen the inquest. Sadly, they didn't do that. I think at every stage of lawfare, whatever you want to call it, there is an opportunity for one side to back down. And even with what we're going to go into, and I'm sure Ted and ourselves will cover that with judicial review, there's going to be an opportunity for the Attorney General to go, yeah, we messed up. We won't keep blocking it and making it hard for you to get this reopened inquest or get it in front of the High Court. But yeah, so for us, it was the only route. There are quite a number of Section 13 applications that go through, or applied and are successful. It's not uncommon, and it's there in the law to help families who don't feel that there's been a proper investigation into their loved one's death.
And the initial application, the Attorney General at the time was, if I remember rightly, Sola Braverman. And I mean, did you get the feeling that she was in any way sympathetic, or has the attitude from her and her successor been pretty much the same?
We've not had any direct communication with them. I mean, typically how these things go, Nick, working from representing the chambers, has been representing us. has been in communication with a legal team at the Attorney General's office. So there's, this is the first time we've had any sort of formal communication. But even then, it was the Solicitor General, not the actual Attorney General. He's like the deputy kind of Attorney General. So I don't think it had any real bearing. I mean, they had a couple of changes from Suella to, I think, the MP for Northampton sat in for a little while, and then it went back, and then it's Victoria Prentice at the moment. I don't think that's made any difference. We've certainly not had any direct dealings with any of the Attorney Generals during the 2-year application.
Okay, and so for people that haven't read the response, what was the response you got from the Attorney General then?
I mean, it was a very short letter. They basically, they said that let me just read it verbatim. In order to grant permission for your application to proceed to the High Court, the solicitor must be satisfied that there is a reasonable prospect that a court will order a new inquest. The solicitor is of the view that this test has not been met. And then they go on to say there's 2 headings: refusal of permission, and then under the interests of justice.
Ted, you could take over at this point. Give us your thoughts.
Yeah, well, basically the first thing that, in essence, the person who wrote the letter on behalf of the Solicitor General, who was responding on behalf of the Attorney General, the first thing they said was, we think that it was reasonable for the coroner in 2013 to rely on the findings of the 9/11 Commission and the FBI investigation. Now, the problem with that, the first problem is that the legal test here is not, is it reasonable? Was it reasonable for the coroner to do such and such? It is, was the coroner's investigation sufficient? And I think that we showed overwhelmingly in the application that it wasn't sufficient. So we can, arguably maybe it was reasonable, but it really doesn't matter. The coroner did not actually establish with any evidence how the airplane caused the tower to collapse. Moreover, the sources that the Attorney General's letter cites, those were not, the 9/11 Commission report was barely referenced in the actual report from the Metropolitan Police, and was barely discussed. It was just a timeline of the events. Similarly with the FBI investigation, as Matt said, the actual report, which Matt and his family finally got their hands on in early 2022, because it was exempt from disclosure prior to that, there was almost nothing in the report. There's very, very little evidence. So to say that the coroner even relied on these documents and these investigations is really not true, because nothing was brought forward from those reports and those investigations. The other thing that they essentially said was, we don't think it's very likely that this evidence is going to overturn the original verdict. And they said something to the effect of, this expert and eyewitness evidence of explosives being used to bring down the towers would not make a meaningful difference to the verdict, or shed any new light on how Jeff came about his death. So on the first part of that, the idea that it's not like that, they think it's not likely, as I already explained, that's not the test. It's not the AG's place to evaluate the evidence and decide if it's likely. The family specifically under the law does not have the burden of proving that it is likely that the new evidence would overturn the original conclusion. Specifically, that is not their burden. All that they are required to do is present the new evidence and to show that there's a mere possibility that it would do it, that it would change the original conclusion. And the Attorney General's letter literally used the words, we think it's unlikely. Well, it doesn't matter if you think it's unlikely. And so basically they violated the law in their response to the application. And that is one of the primary grounds for seeking judicial review, is that their decision is, in a black and white sense, contrary to the law. The other thing that I mentioned of them saying this evidence wouldn't make a difference to the verdict or wouldn't shed any new light. Well, of course it would. So, because the original conclusion is that Jeff died because the airplane impact caused the North Tower to collapse, we're presenting 2,500 pages of expert and eyewitness testimony and other evidence showing that that is not why the North Tower collapsed, that it was explosives and incendiaries. So of course it's going to shed new light on how Jeff died. So not only does the Attorney General make unlawful statements in this letter, the Attorney General and the Solicitor General make irrational statements, which is another basis for challenging this decision upon judicial review. So that's the essence of the letter. And then they even go on to say that the question of how the Twin Towers came down and that whether it was explosives and incendiaries contributed to that is beyond the scope of an inquest. And that's just utterly false. Our barrister, Nick Stanage, he also, as Matt mentioned, he sits as an assistant coroner, and he says this is squarely within the responsibilities and the capabilities of a coroner to evaluate. And the mandate of the coroner is to look at all facts that have any bearing on how any given individual might have met their death. And so obviously the evidence that we brought forward of controlled demolition of the North Tower factors into that. So the letter is truly egregious. It's appalling, in my opinion, and it's an embarrassment. And it's sad because people. I would say that those of us who understood this law to some extent were pretty optimistic because it's an open and shut case that there should be a new inquest ordered. Of course, naturally, there's some degree of pessimism out there in the 9/11 Truth Movement. Of course, the Attorney General is not going to let this go forward. And it's sad that the Attorney General has sort of gone and vindicated that view to some extent, and really broken the law in how they responded to this application. So we're frankly somewhat optimistic. I would say even quite optimistic going forward, because the letter is so poor and so obviously contrary to the law that we can succeed with judicial review. Now, of course, that's going to require the court, the high court, the judge that we go before to be objective and unbiased. And I don't know the British legal system very well, but what I've been told is that we can have some degree of faith that a judge in the high court will be more unbiased, more objective than what we got from the Attorney General.
Yes, indeed, no political agendas, you would hope. But Matt, what are the timescales then? When do you have to have the application in, and how long does it take for a judicial review process to complete?
Well, the first part of that question is very clear. We have, I think it's a day under 3 months, so the 26th of September, something like 27th of September. We have to have the application in, but it's one of these things where time is of the essence. The sooner you've got it in, the better. There are some really strict time frames. If it's things like planning, it's like 6 weeks, but we really want to get it in sort of 2 months max from now, which obviously puts us under a bit of pressure to try and raise the necessary funds to ensure that work gets done. How long it takes to actually make that decision on judicial review, I honestly don't know. Same with we were waiting for the Attorney General to respond. It's a case of there's an average time frame, but we didn't know where we were going to sit in that. We were told after about 6 months it's likely to be 18 months, so we weren't too far off with 22 months. But like I said, lawfare or otherwise, it takes time. So the important thing at this step right now is to get this the various stages of our challenge, getting it going as quickly as possible. And there's various phases. There's a pre-action whole letter that we send back to the Attorney General, laying out effectively our case, requesting them to reconsider and change their decision before we go down the litigation route. Like I said, in UK law, and I guess probably around the world, there's always opportunity for a party to back down, and I think it will become very clear when we address what's in the Solicitor General's letter, that they don't have a chance of surviving this should it go to it before a judge. I was just going to say, I'm not going to say who, but we spoke to someone over the weekend who has been down this process, actually went through the whole judicial review to get an inquest reopened and ended up winning the case. It is possible, even though you get kicked back, the Attorney General says no, that there is a way in which you can move forward. It's just, it's frustratingly slow sometimes, and then other times we obviously got a time limit to respond on, and obviously it does cost money, and that, it's a frustration, but I'm relatively young and I've still got the fight in me. I think it's hard for those that are perhaps they're elderly and they lost, older children, and time's against them to try and fight these sort of things. But I'm not going to give up. I think we've got a very strong case of winning this judicial review.
Oh, okay. Well, let's deal with what people can do to help then. So if we deal with the financial aspect of this, how much money do you need to raise and how close are you to that target? And the other question I have on this is there anything that people can do aside from the money? I mean, for example, if the Attorney General's office, or the Attorney General was to receive communications from a large number of people, would that be helpful, or actually would that be a bad idea?
The more public support, probably the better. I don't know quite how it works in the UK. I know there's petitions and things, but in terms of money, because the work is so front loaded in that initial response back to the Attorney General, we're probably looking at raising a kind of minimum £20,000 in the next, before the end of July, ideally. The total amount, I think, is probably going to be just over 40,000. Should we go all the way to the High Court and actually make representations there, which I think is likely to be the case, unless miraculously the Attorney General does turn around and say, yeah, you made a poor decision. So what are we on? What's the date today? 10th. We've got 3 weeks really to try and get to a point where we are able to at least respond with that first phase of the letter back to the Attorney General, laying out the reasons in law why they have erred. Basically, the Attorney General has erred in their decision on a legal basis. I mean, Ted, you'd probably say a bit more about costs and phases and how to help.
To simplify, break it down, basically we need to raise £20,000 or $25,000 by the end of July, and then essentially, our goal is to raise another $25,000, £20,000 by the end of August, and then we'll be able to carry forward this case completely. But it's pretty urgent that we raise at least the £20,000 or so in the next few weeks, so that the barrister can really get going on this. And as Matt mentioned, the first step will be to send that letter to the Attorney General, informing them that we're going to seek judicial review and on what grounds, and giving them the opportunity to change their position, which we hope it would just end there, but there's a good chance it won't, but there's a possibility that it could. It could also end, there's like another stage where we first have to get the permission to seek judicial review. We get the permission from the court. And so once we get the permission, it often happens that the Attorney General or other public officials in a similar situation, once the permission is granted for judicial review to be sought, then the public official will, then the parties will settle out of court. And in this case, that would mean the Attorney General saying, you know what, I don't want to litigate this. I don't want to spend the next year litigating this. Let's, you guys can have your inquest. So it's totally possible.
Ted, something I wanted to ask you was, obviously for Matt and for Matt's family, this is a personal tragedy. But many of the people that are watching this won't have been born, even potentially on September 11th, 2001. So what do we say to people when we're saying, this is a cause worth supporting? Why would they want to support it?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question, Mike. And I don't think we've quite spoken to it enough. This is about Jeff Campbell and how he died and his family getting the truth. But, as we know, this happened on 9/11. And if this inquest goes forward and we get a coroner to rightly conclude that the Twin Towers were brought down by controlled demolition, that will send shockwaves around the world, in my view. That would be, I've seen how inquests are reported in the UK, and like anytime there's a major inquest on a case of someone dying that was in any way controversial or socially, politically significant, it's widely reported in the UK. And I think that would certainly happen in this case if you were to have a coroner in the West London Coroner's Court conclude that it was controlled demolition that brought down the Twin Towers. So that is our goal, is to create that, that development, and that, that, as I said, it creates shockwaves, and you will then have, millions of people around the world, thousands, hundreds of 9/11 families, thousands of 9/11 family members learning about this and saying, wow, is that how my loved one died as well? And so it really will be a turning point in this larger mission of getting the truth about what really happened on September 11th, 2001, this event that was a turning point in our history. And I assume all of your viewers and millions and millions of people out there disagree with the direction that the United States and our world took after 9/11, and they want to see that curtailed. They want to see it reversed. And so 9/11 and this particular strategy is a pathway to doing that. It is about, and accountability as well, accountability for the people who are behind 9/11, accountability. You would hope that this type of finding in an inquest like this would eventually lead to much more in-depth investigations by U.S. authorities, by other, maybe by international bodies. But this one little thing is like something that we have some degree of control over. This system of the inquest and getting a new inquest is almost tailor-made for us to register in the public mind and in the public record that it was actually demolition that brought down these buildings, and that could be a huge catalyst for getting truth and justice about 9/11.
And Matt, on a personal level, I mean, this isn't just a campaign by Matt Campbell. That your entire family is behind this.
Yeah. I mean, my mum's always supported right from an early days, knowing that I wasn't happy with an awful lot of what we were being told, and she saw me kind of suffer with depression, best part of a decade. Dealing not only with my brother's death, but just uncovering more and more stuff that just didn't sit well at all with me. In particular, the wars that followed 9/11, and it's not, the truth isn't going to bring my brother back. But for me, because of what 9/11 led to, and because I don't feel that my brother had any sort of, justice is the wrong word, because that's not what an inquest's about, and primarily because 9/11 has never actually been in a court of law. They've either been settled, with a guilty plea, or forever stalled. If you look at Guantanamo Bay, or even the Saudi lawsuits that my father's one of the plaintiffs in, we're never going to see stuff in a court of law. So there's not been that kind of normal process of a feeling that there's justice being done after someone's been murdered. And so I don't feel that my brother's life has been looked at in a way in which you'd expect someone's life to be, their death to actually be examined in a court of law. And I'm not even looking to find necessarily the guilty culprits. That's not the point of this inquest, but it's to get that first level of truth, which is so important. And certainly, if in terms of the trauma and stuff, I mean, it's part of the healing process is to know the truth of what's happened. And I know to the day I die, it's going to rattle me that even with what we're doing here, we're not going to know the full truth about 9/11. There's too much cover up going on still today. But this is a really important step, and it will mean a lot to me and my family to at least give Jeff a fair crack of the whip. We're trying to get to the bottom of what went on that day.
Thank you. And so Ted, just in the closing minutes of this, just give us a little bit more about the International Centre for 9/11 Justice. We had Piers Robinson on the UK Column News whenever you launched this initiative, but just you give us, because we unfortunately didn't have you on that day, you give us your thoughts on it.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I mean, the first thing I want to say, by the way, is that in terms of donating to this inquest effort, you can do it at the International Center for 9/11 Justice website. So it's ic911.org, just 5 characters.org, ic911.org. And if you go to the homepage, you'll see it right there at the top, a way to donate to Matt and his family's effort. The International Center for 9/11 Justice, which is collaborating and working and supporting the Campbell family in this effort, was launched about a month ago in early June. And it's actually a coming together of 3 organizations that have been involved, part of the 9/11 Truth Movement for a long time. The first one is the International Center for 9/11 Studies, which is the entity that is now the International Center for 9/11 Justice. And this organization was founded in 2008 by an attorney named James Gorley. And the notable things that it's done over the years, it organized and hosted the Toronto hearings. in 2011, which were held on the 10th anniversary, and brought together, a dozen or so, a dozen and a half of the world's leading 9/11 researchers. And the other organization is the Journal of 9/11 Studies, which has published some of the most important, influential papers in the history of 9/11 truth movement, the canon of 9/11 evidence, and then the 9/11 Consensus Panel, which was founded by David Ray Griffin, perhaps the best known 9/11 researcher in the history of the movement, and his colleague Elizabeth Woodworth back around 2012, and published about 51 consensus points that about 20 experts with various disciplines in the 9/11 truth movement basically all reviewed and agreed upon. And so it was forming a sort of consensus set of points about the most important, best evidence about what really happened on 9/11. So we've brought together these three organizations and the Journal of 9/11 Studies is still, the 9/11 Consensus Panel has finished its work. It was actually published in a book called 9/11 Unmasked a few years ago. But the Journal of 9/11 Studies now is open for business and has been for a long time. And we are publishing papers. There was a little bit of a lull for the last several years, but we are back again publishing papers on a monthly, in some cases weekly basis. And we're looking to one of the focuses, the priorities is that I think you understand, Mike, and many people understand that the evidence of controlled demolition is overwhelming and that the canon of evidence is well established, and which the Journal of 9/11 Studies is partly responsible for. And so we're looking to expand into other areas that haven't received as much attention over the last 10 to 15 years because controlled demolition has received so much attention, I think rightly so, because the evidence is so overwhelming and relatively easy to understand. But we're looking to push the envelope of new evidence in other areas of the 9/11 events, such as the hijackers and how these planes were taken off course, how these planes were able to reach their targets and actually hit their targets, which I think the alleged 9/11 hijackers would not have been able to do, not have been able to manage, and many other aspects. The financing and the alleged hijackers networks and so on, and really get into the who and the why. I think after 20 years, there's a sense, at least among the people that I'm talking to in the movement, that we've spent 20 years developing evidence on the how to some extent, and now we've got to start going towards the who and the why, and developing really good, strong evidence on those questions, and not keep waiting for governments around the world or the U.S. government to do the investigation. And I think we're reaching a critical moment where people that have sensitive information about 9/11 are going to start, have already started, and will even more so start to die off. And so it's critical to try to find primary firsthand sources of information about those events, people who were maybe indirectly involved or even directly involved in the events, who are willing to speak out, or who were sort of cajoled into being involved and maybe didn't want to be, or otherwise have important information. So trying to develop primary source information is also a focus of the organization in the years ahead. We're also doing things like public education. We're producing this film that will be released on the upcoming 9/11 anniversary called Peace, War, and 9/11, featuring Dr. Graham McQueen, who is a very widely respected 9/11 researcher who passed away earlier this year. And the film is based on an interview with him that took place back in October, 6 months before he passed away. And he's a very eloquent and very astute observer of the events of 9/11 and sort of what 9/11 was about in the larger historical context. And so he speaks about that in this interview, in this film. So I encourage people to go. You can watch a trailer for that film on our website, and that's just one of the many things that we're working on right now. So the supporting the Campbell family is a high priority of the organization, and we're honored. I've been honored to work with Matt over the last 4 years to make this effort happen. And as Matt said, we're not ready to give up. So really appreciate people who are able to support this effort. And as we said before, it is urgent for people to donate. We really need to raise at least $20,000, 20,000 pounds by the end of July. So thank you to everyone who's able to donate.
We're just about out of time, but if we finish with Matt, I mean, what are what are your final thoughts and what are your hopes with this process? I'd like to get some thoughts on how this hopefully will end for you.
I hope that we do go down the judicial review path. We're able to raise the funds. We overturn the Attorney General's decision. We get the permission from the High Court, and we get the old inquest quashed and a new one opened. And although the scope of the inquest is quite narrow, it's really for people to, within my own circle of family and friends, to realise there's an awful lot we still don't know or hasn't been in the public realm to do with 9/11. And I said that the very simple fact that none of the new evidence that we've put forward at the inquest was ever considered by the coroner. I was going to do a little backtrack to what you talked about, the police report, Ted, that you mentioned that was exempt from disclosure. I got kind of excited when we finally got hold of that. This is the SA-15, so the counterterrorism, part of the UK, their investigation into 9/11. And when I got it, it was like 2 pages of cut and paste of the 9/11 Commission report. And that kind of thing just really frustrates me that's all we had in the way of an investigation to do with my brother's death. And I just really hope that we get the permission and we get into a court of law, because no one's done it so far. And that is disgusting for an event that killed 3,000 people, that no one's been able to get any form of litigation, nothing, into a court of law to actually properly look at the evidence that's out there. And so I'm just hopeful we're going to get into that position. I really am hopeful.
An event which killed 3,000 people on the day, but of course has killed millions since.
I can't remember what the institute is. I was talking about it with Ted the other day. What do you remember, Ted? The Brown something?
Yes. Brown University cost.
Cost of war. 4.5 million people have estimated to have died in the war on terror. It's disgusting.
We'll leave it on that note. Thank you very much to Matt Campbell and Ted Walton for joining us today. This is still, 9/11 is still a key issue, because so much, as we've said, happened as a result of it. And so I would encourage everybody to help out if you possibly can. Thanks for joining us. We will be back very shortly. Bye-bye.